The pre-dawn was just starting to permeate the treetops with its gentle grays. Through the canopy rose a column of inky, toxic smoke. Below, the bark of the trees and their extended limbs pulsated with the violent orange and yellow glow from the flames of a burning car. The shadows flicked and moved about with the vagaries of the flames. Several paces from where the car sat on its melted tires, the bodies of two men lay crumpled in the thick layer of decaying leaves carpeting the forest floor. One of the men shifted, rolled over slightly, extended a hand covered in dried blood straight up into the air, as if trying to feel for the breeze or for the sun. Then he let the hand fall back to the leaves. He let out a loud groan. Damien convulsed, curled his legs up under him, and groaned again, then slowly got up onto his hands and knees. He spat leaves, dirt, and blood from his mouth. There was a fiery pain behind both of his eyes, as if his brain had tried to burst out of them. There was a searing pain in his thigh. Blood was still seeping steadily from a recent knife wound. Damien ignored the pain, the blood, everything, and began to struggle to stand. When he finally got to his feet, Damien glanced at the nearby pile of shadows that was Hearth, crumpled in the dead leaves a few feet away. Hearth was still motionless except for the spasms of his diaphragm. Well, he'll either live or die, was the only thought Damien spared for Hearth as he looked down with contempt at the other man's prostrate form. Damien turned and stumbled towards the burning car. The heat coming off its flaming husk was intense. Damien was stopped by it, but then, slowly, like a man pushing through a wall, he forced himself to take 2 more steps towards the inferno. He gasped as the overwhelming pain stripped all the strength from his body and he fell to his knees. The front of his body roasted in the heat. His beard and eyebrows were singed off, and the hair at the top of his head began to curl and melt from the heat. He spread his arms in wide supplication. The skin on the palms of his hands began to form blisters. "Your Grace!" Damien cried. Just above the roar of the flames, Damien heard the purr of an oncoming engine from behind him. He shuffled backwards in the leaves, smoke and steam coming off of his face and clothing. A car was approaching the clearing. More sunlight was coming through the trees. Soon the top edge of the sun's corona would appear above the horizon. Damien got back to his feet, composed himself, and slowly turned around. A 2-door sports car was slowly coming down the access road. It stopped near where Hearth lay. The black pillar of oily smoke reflected in its windshield. The sports car's engine shut off. The driver door swung open. A young man with long hair and a beard stepped out. He was dressed in a rustic brown tunic beneath an oversized black leather jacket. The young man stood and stared, dumbstruck at the flaming car, terror and worry in his eyes. Several feet past where the young man stood, there was more motion in the woods. Kyle and Hartley were slowly extracting themselves from the wrecked car where they had driven into a tree during their panicked attempt at escape. The doors to the car no longer opened, so both were climbing out of a rear passenger window that had been left open. Kyle and Hartley were evidently injured from the crash. They both walked like they had broken bones. Kyle had sodium azide burns covering the left side of his face. Hartley's long hair was full of glass shards, and she was bleeding from her scalp. The two of them stumbled over and stood shakily next to the young man in the tunic, mute with shock. Damien slowly raised his left arm and pointed to where Hirth lay. "Put Hirth in the car," Damien commanded. Kyle, Hartley, and the young man all turned towards Hirth. "Not you," Damien snapped, glaring with black eyes at the newcomer. "Fire extinguisher." The young man in the tunic rushed over and opened the boot of the sports car. He pulled out from it a slim white canister. Damien pointed with a commanding finger at the still-burning car. The young man scuttled past Damien and towards the car. He got as close as he could to the fiery wreck and sprayed directly into the back seat. Kyle and Hartley, despite their injuries, started to move the giant slab of meat that was Hirth. Kyle had him under the arms. Hartley stooped and got her arms around Hirth's oversized calves. Hirth was easily bigger than both of them combined, and moving him was like trying to move a dead cow. Despite that, the two acolytes grunted, panted, and strained, joints separating and bones cracking as they struggled to haul the enormous man over to the sports car. With the last of their strength, they folded him in as best they could into its tiny back seat. By the time Kyle and Hartley had finished, the other car was only burning from its front engine block. The inside of the car's passenger area was shrouded with blackened, greasy smoke, but was no longer on fire. "Your altar kit," Damien demanded of the young man in the tunic. The young man obediently ran to the boot of the sports car and retrieved a black briefcase. Then he set it at Damien's feet and opened it. Inside were several vials of soot-colored oils, an assortment of black and red candles, a stole woven from black and gold thread, and a small chalice carved from blood-red agate. "The pyx," Damien demanded sharply. The young man stooped and retrieved from the briefcase a golden container about the size of a hockey puck. Its lid was stamped with what looked like an ankh, but this malignant variant had sharp talons at each of its 3 arms, and tiny horns extending from the top of its loop. Damien took the pyx and snatched off the lid. He stood for a moment, looking with utter scorn at what lay inside the small, cold metal box. He turned the open part of it around and held the pyx up to the young man's face. "Of all the abominations you chattel poisoned my earth with, what is this nonsense?" Damien demanded. The young man stood stock still and made no reply. Damien cast the contents of the pyx, several pentagram-shaped wafers, into the dead leaves at their feet. "You and you," Damien snarled at Kyle and Hartley. "Come hither, take this, and gather the dust of his grace into this container." Damien was obeyed promptly and without hesitation, despite Kyle and Hartley's injuries. They both stumbled over to the smoldering car, disregarding the searing heat that poured from the flames still enveloping the car's engine block. Kyle and Hartley approached the rear of the vehicle, stooped down, and clawed at the glowing hot ashes in the charred remains of the back seat. Among the ashes were numerous long, sharp teeth, and one remaining fragment of an orbital bone. With their burned and ruined hands quaking badly, all was carefully gathered into the gold pyx. The two stumbled back to where Damien stood. They looked at the ground. They said nothing. Their faces were ashen. Hartley carefully handed the pyx to Damien. Damien cupped the tiny metal box in both hands. It was warm. A wisp of sooty, yellowish smoke spilled over its edges. He looked down at it with sorrow and reverence. Several long moments passed. The sun was coming up, and the light in the trees had changed from gray to a warmer blaze. Damien raised his face to Kyle and Hartley. Both withered even further in his gaze. "Beckoned by his grace, you flinched," Damien growled. "In his last moments, you fled." Kyle and Hartley began to tremble violently with fear. "You shrank like chattel from the slaughter-knife rather than burn with him our grace," Damien cried. "You should be sundered where you stand, doomed ones." Neither Kyle nor Hartley dared react in any way. They were practically catatonic with terror. The only hint of movement they made now was to shift ever slightly away from each other, as if each one feared the possibility that the other one was about to violently burst like a balloon full of blood and bones. Damien raised one hand and pointed in a direction that led deeper into the woods. "Now walk, acolytes," he hissed. "Walk until your hearts stop." Singed, burned, and broken, Kyle and Hartley followed Damien's directions and limped off into the trees. Damien turned to the young man in the tunic, still standing perfectly motionless by the sports car. "Take us to the chapel," Damien ordered. The sun was now up. On a disused ecclesiastical property that bordered a wide, flowing creek just outside the city limits, sat an old abandoned chapel. It had a small, crumbling bell tower. Part of its roof was sagging badly and just about fallen in. Much of the pale stucco along the bottom of its walls had given way to dry rot, close to where the walls met the tall grasses that surrounded the place. Its old stained glass had been removed from all the windows and replaced with plywood in some previous age. The sports car tires rolled across the unkempt lawn leading up to the chapel. In the cramped confines of the back seat, Hirth was breathing somewhat normally. The car stopped in front of the chapel doors. Damien climbed out of the passenger side, still holding the pyx that was filled with ashes and fragments. The blood had stopped flowing from his leg. His limp was already beginning to fade. "Pull him out," Damien barked. The young man in the tunic pulled Hirth out of the back seat and dumped him in the high grass. "Leave," Damien ordered. A few seconds later, the car was driving off. Damien stood facing the chapel with the pyx in his hand. Lying at his feet, Hirth's breathing started to come in stilted gasps. Damien waited, motionless. Briefly, he looked up to gauge the sun's position in the sky. Hirth let out a long, pained groan. He rolled over onto his hands and knees and started trying to stand. Damien took 2 steps away from him. "What happened?" Girth grunted when he had gotten to his knees. "Peltry's master is slain," Damien said. "No," Hirth said. The word came out as a long, moaning syllable, as if trying to ward off the reality of what had just happened. Hirth kept repeating the word over and over again, more loudly each time. "You stopped being an acolyte," Damien said, his voice as cold as the Arctic void. The words cut through Hirth like a meat slicer, silencing him instantly. "Remember what you now are," Damien said. Damien looked down at the pyx and sighed deeply. "I hold all that remains of his grace in this box," he said. Hirth's head sank nearer to the ground. He let out another long moan, this one wet with grief and despair that then morphed into a long, keening wail. Then Hirth stopped himself. He stared at the grass for another moment from where he lay. Then with tremendous, heaving effort, he forced his wounded body to stand. When he pulled himself up to his full height, he dwarfed Damien. He was a wide, large man with arms and legs like tree trunks. His sunken eyes and heavy brow made him the kind of man who could dress up as Frankenstein's monster for Halloween just by adding some fake bolts to the sides of his thick neck. Hurth was a head taller than Damien, but his attitude was so obsequious in the senior thrall's presence, it made Hurth seem like the smaller of the two men. "We are weak," Hurth said, puffing hard from the exertion. "Our master, his grace LeBlanc, will sunder us for this. Our existence will end. With a flick of his wrath we will both be sundered. It will all end." "Maybe," Damien retorted. "Maybe not. Go unlock the door." With tremendous effort, Hurth struggled to move his feet. He stumbled over to the steps of the old chapel and up to the door. He fished out a key from his pocket and undid the lock. From behind him, Damien said, "Step aside." He went past Hurth into the chapel. Inside it was not completely dark. There were gaps of sunlight all along the tops of the walls, where small creatures had chewed their way in from outside. Directly overhead was the open belfry of the small bell tower, just inside the main doorway. On the floorboards, beneath the belfry, lay several dead bats. They all had withered into a mummified form that made them look like they were made out of greasy paper. They gave off a slight odor, sickeningly sweet, like that of burning flesh. Damien stepped around them and scrunched up his nose at the smell. Then he peered up into the belfry. "Come here," Damien commanded Hurth, still looking up at what he was seeing. More strength was seeping back into Hurth's injured body. The large man entered the chapel and stood next to Damien. Hurth craned his massive neck and squinted up into the darkness of the belfry. Several more bats slept peacefully above the two men. "Our master, his grace LeBlanc, is nearby," Damien said, gaping up at the slumbering chiropterans. Damien turned and said to Hurth, "Quit breathing on me." Hurth immediately lifted a hand over his mouth and nose. Damien turned back to look up at the bats. "There are others up there besides his," said Damien. Hurth leaned forward carefully to get a better look, still covering the lower part of his face. His hand trembled slightly. "Our grace Zentry is somewhere close by as well," Hurth said to the darker thrall. "Do you think he also knows?" "Of course," snapped Damien. "Don't be so naive. All of them know." Army Major Frances Garda had not heard anything yet from Sergeant Gladys Stoll. Garda continued languishing in her off-base housing in Copperas, Texas, while she awaited trial. Her attorney, Colonel Pearson, had ignored the last few voicemails Garda had left for her. But soon after the sun had dawned, there was another unexpected knock at Garda's door. Garda set her beer down on the coffee table. She looked over at the door, but did not get up. It could easily be MPs showing up at her door, armed with new charges the prosecutor had dreamed up and ready to haul her back to prison. Or it could be that the FBI had returned. Undoubtedly, they were still hunting for her father. Garda waited, not moving from the couch. Oddly, there was no follow-up banging on the door. If it was MPs, the blows to the door would be incessant. If it was the FBI or anyone else, they would have lost patience by now and knocked again. But whoever it was standing on her stoop, they were just waiting quietly. Garda checked out the peephole and saw it was Sergeant Stoll standing on her front step. Garda immediately opened the door and let her in. Stoll was not in uniform. Instead, she was dressed in baggy 511 pants, an ordinary-looking windbreaker, and an inconspicuous ball cap that Stoll had pulled her braid through at the back. "How's your lawyer doing?" was the first thing Stoll asked. "She's gone off the radar for now," Garda replied. "I'm just here stewing in my own juices. Did you manage to find anything?" "Came over the second I thought I had something you could work with," Stoll answered. Then Stoll asked cautiously, "You haven't heard from your dad, right?" "Nope, not ever," Garda assured her. "Okay, I figured that," Stoll said. "But I got a lead on your half-brother." Garda shut the door, then tried offering Stoll some tap water, mostly because that is all she had in the house besides beer. Stoll declined. "Your half-brother's got into a lot of trouble over in Mississippi," Stoll said. "They arrested him right after he brought that girl into the hospital down there." "Was it something to do with my dad?" Garda asked. "Nope, he was arrested on some random unregistered weapons charges," Stoll replied. "He was being charged as a minor." "Was?" Garda asked. "They had him in a holding cell, all locked up, nice and safe, pending a visit to the judge. Then, apparently, he pulled quite a disappearing act. Right from under their noses," Stoll said. "Not sure why he would do that. They would have probably let him go soon enough, but your brother just had to pull a major stunt. And now a serious bunch of people are real mad at him. Half of Mississippi is out looking for him, trying to get him back." "Well, okay, I was going to ask to see him when you first said he'd been arrested, but I guess that's not really possible now," Garda said. Maybe not," said Stoll. Stoll handed Garda an express mail envelope. Garda set it on her kitchen counter and opened it. Inside there were the 3 photographs the FBI had left her, plus there was the copy of the hospital intake documents. Garda scrutinized them for a moment. They were the ones that were all for Caroline Marsh. Then Garda asked, "Is Jack Turner really my brother?" "Well, that's what your DNA test says, apparently," Stoll replied. "You and him definitely have the same dad. Those things are usually never wrong." Then Stoll said, "Trust me, it took some doing and some digging to get anything at all on your brother. I gotta say, he's practically a ghost. Jack Turner, no middle name, no birth records, no immunization or school records, nothing. Didn't go to school anywhere as far as I can tell. Must have been homeschooled. Somewhere off the grid. Looks to me like he's stayed off the grid his entire life so far." "Holy Garda started saying, then stopped herself. She was a soldier, not supposed to be so easily shaken by anything. But the lack of any family connections was a big gaping hole in her psyche she never really knew was there. And now it was possible that such a hole could suddenly not be quite so empty. The effect this was having on Garda was tectonic. "You can keep all that," said Stoll. "I did find one little scrap of information on the boy, though. Here." One of the documents Stoll provided Garda was a copy of a life insurance policy. The policy was owned by someone named Dale Harness. The policy was for Jack Turner, but Harness was the sole beneficiary. "See, your half-brother must have worked for this Harness guy. All of it for cash, under the table," Stoll was saying. "There's no income taxes that ever got registered that have your brother's name on them. But that didn't stop this Harness guy from taking out a life insurance policy on your brother." "Wait, they let you do that?" Garda asked. Stoll smirked and shrugged. "The insurance companies allow employers to do it all the time." "So," Garda asked, "someone who works for you like an employee, if they die, you get the insurance money?" "Yep, that's right," Stoll replied. "America's quite a country, isn't it? Yeah, so your half-brother was working for this guy, under the table, off the books for cash, as it seems he likes to do. But this Dale Harness guy goes and slaps your brother's name on an insurance policy. I'll bet my boots Harness made no mention of this to your bro. But there it is. There's Harness's address. It's a lead, at least." Let me tell you something else, Stoll went on. The local police down in Mississippi are looking for your brother right now. The local county sheriff's department is looking for him. The state police are involved. But they haven't activated any resources outside the state. That makes me pretty sure your brother is still somewhere in the area. I'd say that, at least for the time being, he's still in Mississippi. Stoll tapped the mugshot where the name of the small city in central Mississippi was emblazoned. Stoll said, I'll bet he may not have even left town yet. Garda picked up the third photograph of the young woman in the hospital bed. Nobody's sure yet what Caroline Marsh's connection is to your brother, Stoll said. All we know is that they were both in some sort of dust-up together, and your brother was the one who brought her to the hospital. She's given statements to the police, but I'm not privy to the details of those statements. Not yet, at least. Suffice to say, this Marsh lady probably would have more information on your brother than anybody else at the moment. But also, I guess you could start with this harness guy, too. Garda looked at the address and the insurance form. What is this place? Garda asked. That Harness owns a farm in Arkansas, just on the border with Mississippi. That's probably where your brother was doing work for him. If I leave Copperas for a few days, how long do you think I got until the MPs track me down? Garda asked Stoll. Stoll replied with her customary smirk and shrug. Major, I think they're happy to give you enough rope to hang yourself with. If you go off reservation, I'd say you have a week before anything gets set in motion against you. Garda left her home within an hour of Stoll's visit. She hired a rental car at the airport and started driving east. The sun was well past its zenith. The location of Devon Clark was no longer a mystery. The prisoner needed to be transported from the police headquarters to the city hospital for treatment of the head wound he'd received, no doubt at the hands of Jack Turner. Clark began coming to his senses while being strapped to a gurney. As the medics were loading him into the ambulance, Clark returned to his old habits of screaming obscenities and spitting at the closest authority figure. Everyone at the precinct was now looking for the juvenile known as Jack Turner. There was a citywide containment procedure underway. Roadblocks were set up around town. Police canine units were deployed. No officers were allowed to go home, even if it was the end of their shifts. Others were called back in. Amid all this heightened activity, Carrington and Guthridge had been ordered to stand down. They were among the last to have been involved in the handling of the Jack Turner case. They were to be among the first to be grilled by Internal Affairs regarding his escape. Carrington and Guthridge sat glumly on either side of Guthridge's desk. Each held a pen in one hand and an escape incident report in the other. Okay, let's start with what's on my 1052 and make sure it's the same as what's on yours, Carrington was saying to Guthridge. Okay, fine, let's see, Guthridge said. Give the name and address of the last person seen with or controlling the inmate or prisoner. Well, I guess technically that's Officer Abbott. But Internal Affairs might also consider us responsible for this as well, since we handed Turner over to him. Guthridge continued. Give the name, address, and agency of the officer who recaptured the escapee. Well, we better be sure we can put our names on that line by the time we got to turn these things in. Carrington continued reading from his copy of the incident report form. If the defendant was under sentence at the time of the escape, obtain a certified copy of the indictment or accusation. A certified copy can be obtained from the clerk of the court which sentenced the defendant. Good luck with any of that, Carrington said. For starters, this guy's got no data trail. All right, screw this, said Guthridge, tossing her copy onto a pile of other paperwork. This is a waste of my time right now. Let's get back to the control room and see if anyone spotted this guy. "Detective Guthridge," Carrington said, feigning shock and disapproval. "Internal Affairs will be so disappointed if they don't get their 10:52s on time." "Long hours of pointless paperwork are for people who love to never go home from this place," Guthridge said. "Have at it." "Low blow, Detective Guthridge," Carrington chided. "First thing I want us to do is check over the video feed again," said Guthridge. "You're welcome to come with me." The two detectives pushed their way through the crowd of officers who had gathered around the monitors in the control room. They approached one of the officers who was at the terminal that managed the department's new Eye in the Sky program. Since earlier that year, a private company had been contracted by the city to keep a small aircraft in the air over the city, day and night. The aircraft was equipped with a powerful camera that filmed all events on the ground for a radius of 3.5 miles from the city's center. If any crimes were reported to the area, the police department could simply go back over the recording that the Eye in the Sky provided. Publicly, it was still a controversial program, but what made it so enticing to officials was that, potentially at least, law enforcement investigation could just be a matter of hitting the rewind button. That aircraft had been in the air during Turner's escape. "Where are we with the search?" Guthridge asked. Guthridge was told the Eye in the Sky software just needed a few minutes to chew through all the data so it could pick out Turner and tell the police where he had gone since exiting the building. The police department had contracted with another private firm that provided access to the escape interdiction algorithm, which is statistical modeling software that is supposed to predict which roads or other public arteries a suspect might take when fleeing the scene of a crime. The software had been fed Jack Turner's height, weight, and predicted walking speed. "Well, I guess it's just a matter of time, then," Carrington said, as the various digits and nodes blinked on the screen in front of him. On the sidewalk, outside a post office a few blocks from the precinct, Turner dropped Abbott's key card into a mailbox. Per the schedule posted on its lid, the mail was about to be collected. Turner propped the umbrella he had been carrying up against the wall of the adjacent post office building. Turner took to the shade of a portico on the side of the building. He pulled on a raincoat and a ball cap he had just snagged from the back of someone's chair while he was making his way out of the precinct a few minutes before. The ball cap barely fit Turner's massive head. The raincoat was size XXL and was even more difficult to squeeze into. The sleeves only made it past his elbows. Even with the new clothing, Turner felt painfully aware of how visible he was in the full light of day. He still had the two broken ends of the handcuffs around both wrists. In just a matter of minutes, the streets and the air would be buzzing with police activity, searching for an escapee. Plus, more and more people had a camera incorporated into their cellular phones these days. There was nothing Turner could do if someone chose to take an interest in him and start filming. But Turner was not in an unfamiliar place. He had been wandering the streets of this town for the past several months, day and night. Not only was he more vigilant than the average person, Turner possessed a memory far keener than most. He had the location of just about every surveillance camera mapped out in his head. Every camera hovering over a bank lobby entrance, every gas station security camera, every speed camera. He was fully aware of the Eye in the Sky, its radius, the rate at which it flew, its azimuth and elevation, and the resulting gaps formed in the overhead camera's visual field from buildings, bridges, and other obstacles as it passed by overhead. Turner could mentally map out a route of blind spots between where he stood on the sidewalk next to the post office and where he needed to go. With hands shoved deeply into the pockets of the raincoat, Turner set out across town, moving swiftly. In less than an hour, Turner had reached the outskirts of the city. Police activity had definitely picked up. if he could not tell by the increased number of squad cars he had to avoid, or by the sight of police helicopters hovering in the city sky, Turner could practically feel an increased level of hectic energy in the air. Even the birds could tell something was amiss. Great frantic clouds of starlings flitted among the treetops overhead. The crows were making more noise than usual. Turner was now taking cover where the sprawl of the town began to thin out, making way here and there for patches of scrub and undeveloped woodland. This partial no-man's land intermixed vestiges of the town's earlier incarnations that had once focused on industry and the river, with the modern-day town that had mostly turned its back on both. In this place, polluted waterways flowed lazily through a rusted-over, weed-choked district of shuttered factories and abandoned mills. Turner rested in the shade cast by the rear wall of a convenience store, just outside the radius of the last surveillance camera. There was a spigot jutting out of the back of the building. Turner squatted down, turned the handle of the spigot until just a small stream of water started coming out. Turner leaned down and took a drink. Then he turned off the spigot, stood, and slipped into the stand of trees behind the building as softly and quietly as an urban deer. Turner's path through the trees curved around to the side of a busy road. Vehicles drove up and down the byway, ferrying their owners between air-conditioned houses and the parking lots of faraway shopping centers. As each one passed, their occupants were all unaware of Turner's hulking presence just inside the tree line. Turner waited under the cover of the branches until the last car and the last pickup truck had zoomed by and there was no sound of oncoming tires. Then he darted from one side of the road to the other. He took a few giant steps inside the tree line on the opposite side and fell flat on his stomach, out of sight as more traffic appeared. These were police cars. 4 of them. Turner did not move a muscle. The 4 escutcheoned vehicles, overhead lights and sirens blazing, roared up to Turner's position. Then they roared past, destined for some other rendezvous. He waited a while. There was no rush. Turner was 20 feet off the side of a busy road, hidden by weeds, thin young trees, and cast-off trash where nobody ever bothered to even look. More vehicles came and went. A giant fat pickup truck with elevated tires seemed to slow as it was about parallel to where Turner lay. Turner heard an automatic window roll down and commercialized music blare forth from the cab of the truck. An empty soda bottle bounced off a webwork of vines and briars just above Turner's head. Then the muffler of the truck roared flatulently and the vehicle was gone. A brief silence returned to the world. Turner stood and walked deeper into the woods. Back at the precinct, 0 results were coming in from any of the technology that had been deployed in the search for Jack Turner. Data from the eye in the sky so far returned no matches to him. Nothing from the escape interdiction algorithm protocol had produced any results for Jack Turner. None of the officers currently cruising the town in squad cars had seen anybody matching the escapee's description. Carrington was growing frustrated. Sitting in a building and waiting for computers to provide him with clues had never been Carrington's mode of operation, and now he was kicking himself for doing so and allowing precious time to slip by. He went back and found Guthridge in the control room. "Play me back that Sky with the Eye tape again," Carrington said. "I want to see the first 5 minutes after we think Turner got out of the building." "Sure thing," Guthridge said. She was becoming just as exasperated. "Work your magic, detective." Guthridge stepped aside. Carrington stooped over the monitor, hand placed on top of it, sighed deeply, and stared at the footage. Then he started rewinding and replaying a certain section of the video. "What does that look like to you?" he asked Guthridge. Guthridge leaned in to look. What am I looking at? Asked Guthridge, peering intently at the screen. That, right there, Carrington said, pointing to a gap between two buildings 2 blocks from the precinct. A circular shape popped out from in front of one of the buildings, bobbed across the street, and crossed into an alley and was out of sight after that. Holy hell, someone's carrying an umbrella, Guthridge said, on a bright, hot, sunny day. And they're holding it at an angle, like they're holding it pointed at the camera overhead. This thing is programmed to detect anything we tell it to, right? Any parameters we feed into it, right? Carrington asked. Yep, said Guthridge. And what exactly did we tell this thing to look for? Carrington asked. Guthridge hit a few keys on the computer, then said, It's estimating Turner's gait by using his weight, height, and vector angle of the overhead aircraft, and also averaging walking speed, assuming he's on foot. Nothing that would match anything if someone was just walking along, hunched over, underneath an umbrella? Carrington asked. Maybe changing their gait up a little bit, going a little slower or a little faster? No, said Guthridge. It just looks for what we tell it. Carrington swore under his breath, then turned to face the room full of his fellow officers. Okay, I want everyone to stop what they're doing and go back and check their desks right now, he yelled. Is anybody here missing a damned umbrella? Several hours into what was going to be a very long drive for Army Major Frances Garda, the Texas landscape was still flat but starting to grow noticeably greener. Garda was running low on coffee. She kept her foot on the gas until she saw a blue and white sign that read, Food, second right. 5 minutes later, she was pulling her rental car into the parking lot of a large gas station that doubled as a roadside convenience store. Garda put the car in park, killed the engine, and pressed her aviator glasses up onto her dark hair. She had, at least for the time being, abandoned her army persona. Garda was dressed in civilian clothing. She had let her hair hang straight to her shoulders. She still wore boots, but they were civilian in make, bought from a big box store out by the highway exits. The cardboard container they came in had the word tactical emblazed on it. But all Garda cared about was that they were cheap, inconspicuous, and practical. Garda did not get out of the car yet. She reached over to the passenger seat next to her and picked up the pile of photographs that lay there. She looked at the photograph of Marsh and puzzled over it. Garda thought about all the different ways the hospital staff and the local police would keep her from ever speaking with Marsh when she got there. Garda set the photo down and picked up the 2 photos of her half-brother. While almost everyone in the modern world have family photos as the mental backdrop of their lives, this was an entirely new thing to Garda. Seeing pictures of a living relative was like seeing proof of Bigfoot. After a few minutes, Garda climbed out of her rental car and into the East Texas heat. She went inside to buy coffee, still mulling over the photos in her head. The place was quiet when she walked in. There was just one cashier on duty, a kid who looked stoned, leaning up against the shelf full of nicotine products. There was a pair of white earphones blaring away on both sides of his head. His thin, almost translucent young face was tilted down at a cell phone. A man with a red ball cap askew on his head hovered near a rack of candy. The man was carrying a green backpack. There were blue headphones on his head. Garda could hear the music from them blaring away as she walked past him. Other than that, Garda had the place to herself. Garda walked over to the coffee dispensers. Now she was thinking over the hospital schematics Stoll had given her that morning, the ones for where Marsh was being held, thinking in terms of ingress, objectives, and egress. Garda started preparing a large to-go cup of hot black coffee. Family. Tectonic. Garda suddenly wished her mother was still around to show those photographs to. Garda would have loved to know what her mom thought of all this. But her mom was dead, and there was nothing Garda could do about that now. So she dismissed those musings in her mind. What she could do right now was get to Mississippi and find her brother inside the limited window of time that fate and the army was granting her. Behind Garda and her thoughts, the man in the red ball cap and headphones approached. Garda could hear the music get louder. Then he slammed his green backpack into the back of her shoulders. "Well, oh, baby, my bad," she heard the man say from behind. "You okay?" Garda looked down at the coffee. She had been made to spill some of it. "You okay?" the man asked. "You gotta watch where you're going." Garda said nothing. She grabbed a handful of napkins and started cleaning up the coffee. "Oh, I apologize for that," the man was saying as Garda silently refilled her cup. Garda put the lid on the to-go cup, turned, and headed for the front of the store. There was nobody else in the place other than the cashier, who had his earphones in and was still staring down at the screen of his mobile device. Garda kept walking at an easy, unhurried pace. Still, the guy with the backpack had to lengthen his stride a bit to keep up. "Hey, slow down," she heard the man with the backpack say behind her. "What you in a rush for?" Garda looked up with just her eyes and made a mental note of where the security cameras on the ceiling were pointing, and where they were not. The cashier still hadn't noticed a thing. Nobody else came into the place, appeared out of the back, or emerged from one of the restrooms. "Pay attention! Hey, pay attention so you don't walk into people!" the man was now saying. Garda ignored him. She took a left down the aisle marked groceries. The man also took a left just behind her. "Why you dressed like that?" she heard him saying. "Why you dressed like that?" Garda set her coffee on the shelf next to a row of canned soups. The man tried telling Garda his name. Garda said nothing back. Instead, she plucked one of the larger cans of soup from the shelf. She took a second to heft it in her hand, getting a feel for its weight and its shape. The man with the backpack asked Garda if she planned on fixing dinner for him. Garda turned to face the man with the backpack. She was holding the can of soup in both hands now. The man parted his lips and drew in his breath. He was getting ready to say something else. Garda kicked him between the legs, driving hard, shin first, pushing with her ground foot, twisting her whole hip into the action. For a fraction of a second, the man was lifted slightly out of his purple sandals. The backpack fell from his shoulder, and the headphone fell over his face. Then his head and upper body lurched forward from the blow. The man's hands went instinctively to his crotch the instant Garda's leg collided with his pelvis. A second later, his legs buckled, and he collapsed straight down on his knees on the floor in front of Garda. In the fleeting moment, before excruciating pain would hit him like a tidal wave, the man sucked in his breath again. He was enraged at this woman who he couldn't force to cower. He was livid that this woman wasn't trying to placate him. If he couldn't do anything else before being paralyzed by agony, he was going to fill the air with a torrent of vile shrieking, full of self-righteous fury, indignation, and gratuitous profanities. But Garda raised both hands up quickly over her head, engaged several sets of muscles, and drove the can of soup straight down, smashing it with devastating force onto the top of the man's head before he could pollute the world with a single other syllable. Garda set the can back in place and picked up her coffee. She walked over to the row of cash registers. The cashier finally looked up from his mobile device. He pulled out one of his earphones. "Self-checkout's working," he said, indicating the row of automated machines next to Garda. Garda took a crumpled bill out of her pocket and dropped it on the counter. "You got to clean up over in groceries," she said. and walked out without waiting for her change. Garda climbed back into her rental car and set the coffee carefully into the cup holder. Thoughts of family were compartmentalized for now. Her mind was back to what awaited her down the road. Not having a plan meant arriving unprepared, a very bad thing in Garda's experience, which included gunfights in desert towns halfway around the world. In the constantly shifting arena of war, Garda had grown skilled at formulating plans and arriving prepared within very short time frames. She employed those skills now as she started the car and put it in gear. The hospital, security countermeasures, possible approaches, repositions and objectives. Garda turned all these over in her mind. She continued driving eastward across Texas, headed for Arkansas. Turner lay naked and caked in a heavy layer of dried mud. He was hidden beneath a thick cover of twigs and dead leaves he had scraped from the woodland floor. He had plugged his ears with mud to keep out beetles, but he could still hear quite well. Turner lay like this, motionless, for hours. A police dog team had trudged past him through the thick underbrush twice, combing the banks of the creek, trying to find any trace of him. They were gone, but Turner could hear the squawk and chirp of at least 2 police cars parked on a road about a football field's length from him through the trees. Turner held perfectly still. Another hour passed, and then Turner could make out the telltale whine of a small outboard motor. A police department skiff glided slowly next to the banks of the creek. For a moment it was perpendicular to Turner's position. There was a flicker of smooth movement through one of the minuscule gaps in the leaves and twigs Turner had piled over himself. It was the tip of some kind of antenna mounted on the bow of the boat. Then it was gone. An hour after that, the squad cars parked out on the road had moved on as well. Turner still waited. He was in no rush. He had spent a lot of time on rivers and creeks like this one. It had been part of his rather unorthodox education as a child. Turner couldn't be kept in school when he was a boy. It was bad enough that he was too smart for his teachers. But several of his earliest classmates had ended up in hospital emergency rooms because they didn't know any better than to just leave the quiet, awkwardly tall outsider alone. His single mom had homeschooled Turner henceforth. Turner's mother had served in the Army until about the time he was born. Many of the lessons his ex-military mother provided for him as a young homeschooled boy was the same tradecraft she learned on her old job. This included riverine operations and swim infiltration. Turner had spent many hours and days in waterways such as the one he lay next to under the thick layer of twigs and leaves. Once, Turner and his mother started out in a wet spot in the middle of a cow field, walking along and following its course until it became a small, rocky creek running through the woods. After another hour of picking their way along the rocks, the thick scrub on either bank hiding mother and boy from the rest of the world, the creek became wider. Turner and his mom followed it, never stepping outside the creek and thus never leaving a single footprint. Turner remembered noticing for the first time how each successive creek was about twice as wide as the previous one. Around sundown, the creek became a regular river. Mother and son stayed in that river, clinging to a discarded tire. Together they floated down it, all through the night, making no noise, and never getting detected by anyone living along its banks. At sunrise, Turner and his mom finally exited the water by climbing up onto the dock of a yacht club, to the shock and amazement of several morning boaters. Turner missed his mom. After leaving the military, she went into business as a private detective in order to support herself and her child. This line of work meant she poked around in a lot of dark corners for a living. There was risk to this. The world is full of dark corners. One of them, finally, turned out to be an entrance to a chasm. A rather straightforward case that his mother had taken started out simply as some inquiries into a crooked former senator named Bo Doty. That case eventually grew to consume Turner's mom. In the end, it led to her death. But before that happened, there were events that took place during the investigation that altered Turner's mom in ways that the young boy could not comprehend at the time. Turner could remember the night of his 9th birthday. His mother told him she would be back by sunrise. She had arranged to meet with a person she believed could be an informant in the Bo Doty case. Whoever this possible informant was, they had sent a driver to pick up Turner's mom from the little bungalow where they lived. The driver had pulled up in an old Cadillac right as the sun was setting. Turner watched what was happening through the bungalow's front picture window. The driver of the Cadillac was dressed to the nines in an old-fashioned suit, complete with a vest and a fedora, like a character from an old black-and-white movie. He tilted the fedora and politely held one of the rear doors open for Turner's mom. Turner did not see his mother again after that for several days. There was no word from her. Turner stayed locked in the house, eating cold cereal and waiting. Eventually, by the light of a full moon, his mother came back home, but she was already in the early phases of very deep alterations. In the months that followed, Turner's mother stopped eating completely, as far as Turner could tell. She would fix meals for him, distractedly, but would never sit and eat with him. Animals acted differently around her. She started sleeping all through the day in the back bedroom, where she had taped newspaper over the windows. All the while, Turner knew instinctively that his mom was desperately trying to protect her son from something, but he couldn't imagine what. Shortly before Turner's 10th birthday, his mother sat down in the kitchen with him and told him everything. In the gloom of the kitchen, with the light of the moon coming through the window and reflecting in her eyes, making them glow, she told the boy Turner a long and dreadful story. It was a story about lesser princes of hell, about people they coerced into serving them, about feeding and ruling, and about the many webs the princes wove through all the fibers, networks, and connections of the living world. It was a hard thing for a little boy to go through. His mother, the person who had been his provider, his teacher, his protector, the only person he had ever loved, was turning into something he knew he had to be very, very afraid of. It took Turner years afterwards to parse, understand, and come to grips with everything his mom told him that night. But she had told him everything. He had what he needed to hunt down those who were responsible. The sun was starting to hang low through the trees that lined the creek where Turner lay hidden. There were no more sounds of motors or dogs or radios to indicate local law enforcement was still in the area. Turner sat up. The pile of sticks and leaves fell away from him. Beneath him, sealed in a black trash bag, were his clothes and shoes. Turner opened the trash bag, blew air into it so that it puffed up, and tied the bag tightly shut, trapping the air inside. Carrying the bag, he strode into the water of the creek. He went out into the center where the water was up to his chest. He sank down until only his nose stuck out of the water, just behind the trash bag. From where he got in, the creek flowed out of town, away from the city. Turner lifted his feet off the muddy creek bottom and floated away with the current. At Carrington's prompting, several officers had pulled themselves away from the eye-in-the-sky monitors. The precinct building was searched up and down for more clues as to what happened to the escaped prisoner, Jack Turner. One officer returned and reported he was missing an umbrella from his desk. It fit the exact description of the umbrella Carrington spotted on the overhead video. Another officer reported missing a raincoat and a ball cap. Officers combing the streets outside located Abbott's key card at the post office. The missing umbrella was found soon after that. The video was exhaustively combed through, again, by people this time, and not an algorithm. They looked for anyone in the missing raincoat and ball cap. More officers from other parts of the state were brought in and added to the citywide search effort. As a result of the new shakeup, Carrington and Guthridge were allowed back onto the search. They were no longer to be punitively pinned to their desks while the hunt for Turner continued without them. Regardless of all the changes in the escapee recovery effort, Carrington knew there was still going to be plenty of hell to pay after Turner got found and was back in custody. Officer Abbott was facing an automatic suspension. That was just for starters. Internal Affairs set up a special operating team in a spare office down the hall from where Carrington and Guthridge had their desks. Even if it didn't stick in the end, having a charge of serious breach of duty leveled against him was going to mar Carrington's record until he retired. If he retired, Carrington reminded himself. Anything was on the table at this point, including termination and loss of certification as an investigator. But cops, like Carrington and Guthridge, don't last very long unless they are blessed with a certain inability to get rattled. Guthridge went home to get cleaned up and change your clothes. Carrington stayed at the precinct. He sat down on a plastic folding chair in one of the back hallways and put his feet up on another plastic folding chair right next to him. While the search for Jack Turner swirled all around him, Carrington took a nap. At first, Carrington thought he had woken up in his bedroom back at his house. There were no lights. He was staring up into complete darkness. But then he was overwhelmed with the smell of wet mud and rotting leaves. He reached upwards into the dark air. He could see his hands and his wrists as he did so. The skin on his hands and wrists seemed to glow somehow. All else was pitch black. When they were not yet fully extended to arm's length, Carrington's hands touched rough wooden planks. There was no panic when this happened. Carrington felt no fear as his fingers caressed the underside of a coffin's lid and gently traced the grain of its wood. His fingernails were oddly long and had begun to form points. He heard a voice fill the darkness around him. "Infection." "Yes, Your Grace," Carrington responded. The lid of the coffin swung open, revealing a vista of blackened mountains in the distance, a sky of black clouds burning at their edges in crimson reds, radioactive greens, and sickly yellows. There was a valley spread out below him. Out of it flowed a river, but instead of water it ran black with oil. There was a town in the valley along the river's banks. There were no lights on in any of the buildings or street lamps. It was illuminated from several of the buildings in the town that were burning. People were running from street to street, shooting at each other. Their weapons were the only things in the entire landscape below that looked clean and bright. Everything else seemed covered in soot. Carrington was high up and far away, but the crackle of gunfire and screams still faintly reached his ears. The sounds and sights, and also the smell, was a compendium of apocalyptic horror. Yet still it all pleased Carrington's senses. Whenever one of the people far below was struck with bullets, the velvety and intoxicating scent of blood wafted over him. Carrington looked down at his body. He was wearing a very expensive, very old-fashioned suit. It was a well-tailored three-piece suit. There was even a pocket watch in one of the vest pockets with a gold chain. On his feet were a pair of very expensive-looking oxblood wingtips. They were caked in red mud. From one of the clouds, a large avian creature descended silently and swept towards Carrington on wings that were unnaturally wide. As it got closer to him, Carrington saw that it was a gigantic vulture. It had a black body and a featherless head and a neck of bare, bone-white flesh. The vulture flapped its terrible wings and swooped close to Carrington. Then it halted in the air just above him. The vulture had become a man, or at least the desiccated corpse of a man. The head was hairless like a skull. The nose and eyes were gone. There was some dried, leathery skin still clinging to the face around the cheeks and the lips, and there was a set of translucent, gnarled ears sticking out of the sides of the head. The corpse either grew in size or came closer to Carrington. Either way, its cadaverous form came to fill almost all of Carrington's field of vision, blotting out the sight of the burning valley and combusting sky. Its arms were bare, but the rest of its body, from the armpits down, was loosely swathed in a burial shroud. The shroud wasn't tattered so much as it had been shredded and torn by teeth. The bones were exposed in both of the forearms of the corpse, and when the wind blew the shreds of the shroud to one side, Carrington could see that the front of the abdomen had been partially chewed away, exposing the entrails and the top of the pelvic bone. "Put your hand in," the corpse said to Carrington. There were now twin orbs of evil yellow light flickering in both eye sockets. Carrington put one of his hands into the opening in the fiend's abdomen below where the belly button used to be, and pressed against the cold, serpentine intestines. "Pestilence," the corpse spat. Carrington could see that its mouth contained almost 100 small teeth, yellowed, cracked, all very sharp. "Pestilence," Carrington said back to the monster. "Inversion," it hissed, sounding like a gigantic snake that could swallow the whole world. "Inversion," Carrington repeated back. "Mockery," it said. Carrington's flesh all of a sudden turned ice cold. The sounds of the screaming and the gunfire below became like shards of glass in his mind, tearing at his interior over and over again. The smell of the blood in the valley below now made him want to vomit. "Mockery," the creature demanded, its voice sounding like steam jettisoned from a volcano that was trying to come back to life. "No," Carrington whimpered. Then he started screaming. "No, no, no!" Carrington woke up from Guthridge kicking the bottom of his shoe. "No!" he cried. "What?" Guthridge replied. "You having a bad dream, detective?" Did you find Turner?" Carrington said immediately. The dream was already fading. "Still gone. They're still looking," Guthridge said. "They?" Carrington asked. "I still got an active investigation, Turner or no Turner," Guthridge said. "I have to find out who got shot with a silver bullet last night." Carrington stood up. "Hey," said Carrington, "have we gotten any more information about this Dennis Peltry guy that Marsh mentioned?" Guthridge gave him a blank look for a second, then asked, "You mean the guy Marsh said was driving the Cadillac? Why are you asking that?" "Something tells me he's going to be key to our investigation," Carrington said. "Why do you say that?" Guthridge asked. "Did you get more information on the guy?" Carrington struggled to recall the dream, but it was completely gone by now. I don't know," he replied. "Call it a tickle on the back of my neck, I guess." "Look," he ventured, "is anybody but you working your investigation?" "Everyone else is looking for the Jack Turner kid," Guthridge said. "It's just me for now, but I want to pull you in on this with me, if that suits you." "Suits me fine," Carrington said. "At least Yvonne Clark is no longer missing. He awake?" "Yeah," said Guthridge. "They still got him at the hospital, restrained." "Same hospital as Marsh?" Carrington asked. "Just one floor down from where Marsh is recovering," Guthridge replied. "They got Yvonne Clark in one of the secure rooms just off the ICU. You up for another visit to the hospital?" "Two birds with one stone? That sounds like a good use of our time," Carrington said. "Let's go, but let's stop for coffee on the way over there. A sign of the times is that modern hospitals come not just with good ICU units, but those units often have special rooms off to the side. These rooms are equipped with beds that have wrist and ankle restraints. These rooms come equipped with multiple safety features, such as heavy-duty security doors that lock from the outside, and large windows with shatter-resistant glass that help the hospital staff to see in, to make sure they know what they're getting into before walking in. Devon Clark was handcuffed to a bed inside one such room when Carrington and Guthridge arrived. "Mr. Clark," Carrington said as he swept into the room and set a container of coffee down on a table by the door. "Sorry to see you in such a bad way. How's the head doing?" Clark gave Carrington no answer. Clark's head was shrouded in several layers of heavy bandages, but Carrington could still see the upper half of Clark's face. The hospital staff had to put a surgical mask across the lower half of his face so he would stop trying to spit on them. Clark kept his eyes closed, and at the sound of Carrington's voice, Clark scrunched up his face into an infantile, sulking expression. Then he turned his head away from Carrington and Guthridge. "What exactly happened in the holding cell they had you in back at the precinct, Mr. Clark?" Carrington asked. He reached over and pulled the surgical mask down around Clark's chin. "There," Carrington said. "That ought to help you in your efforts to speak more, articulately." Clark just whined some words in Carrington's direction, barely moving his lips as he did so. Carrington apologized, said he couldn't quite make out what Clark was saying, and leaned in closer to listen. Clark turned his head and repeated himself, a little louder this time. It was his two favorite words again. "Mr. Clark, seriously, have we already arrived at the full extent of your vocabulary?" Carrington asked. "How are you going to get on with your state-appointed attorney when you finally make it into court for all the charges you're facing?" Devon Clark repeated his two favorite words again, over and over this time, at the top of his lungs, straining at his wrist and ankle straps as he did so and with spit spraying past his lips. Carrington sighed and pulled the mask back up over Clark's face. Then he picked up his coffee, walked out, and shut the door behind him. Guthridge said, "Did you get anywhere with Mr. Clark?" "Nah," Carrington said. "Okay, let's go pay Miss Marsh another visit." Caroline Marsh was wide awake when the two detectives came up to the next floor and knocked on her door. She was still hooked up to an IV and to a few monitors. She had been brought a meal, but it all remained on the metal tray stand untouched. The lights in the room were off, and Marsh was sitting straight up, staring out the window. "Okay, Miss Marsh, how we doing?" Guthridge said. The sun hung very low in the western sky. It was a deep blood red, staring back at Marsh. She did not answer Guthridge. The sun held all of Marsh's petrified attention. "Miss Marsh, now we know you've been through a tough time," Guthridge said softly, "but we have to ask you some more questions." "Miss Marsh?" Carrington interjected. "Miss Marsh, you're gonna have to speak to us." Marsh just continued staring at the sun. Her mouth hung open slightly, and her jaw began to quiver. Carrington stepped over and waved a hand a few inches in front of her face. This seemed to gain her attention, and she turned to the two detectives. "You have to protect me," she said. Carrington and Guthridge could see that tears were starting to form and spill down her face. "Oh, indeed, we intend to," Carrington assured her. "But for now—" "Protect me!" Marsh screamed. She jumped up to a standing position on her bed, knocking over her tray stand and her IV. One of the monitoring machines on the wall behind Marsh began to make a high-pitched beeping sound. "Okay, we will," Carrington shouted, moving to block the hysterical, panicking Marsh from taking a bad fall off the edge of her bed. "Miss Marsh, we're going to help you, but first you got to sit down," Guthridge said. She had taken up position on the other side of the bed. It took 2 nurses and the on-duty physician to calm Marsh down enough to get her to sit in the bed again. The 2 detectives had to step out of the room while the hospital staff got Marsh cleaned up. She had wet herself. Carrington paced the hallway. Guthridge got on her phone and made arrangements for a patrol officer to be stationed outside her hospital room door all night. "Miss Marsh, I got you overnight protection," Guthridge told Marsh after she and Carrington were allowed back into the room. "And the 2 of us won't leave this room until an officer shows up and stations his or herself right at that door." "You needn't worry about anyone from this cult showing up to pay you a visit," Carrington assured her. "Cult? What cult?" Marsh asked. "The people who took you," Carrington said. "How else are we to refer to these people who kidnapped you?" "The cult," Marsh said again, but this time in a low, childlike whisper. "Okay, cult," Carrington said. "I mean, that's the way you describe them, isn't that right? Don't they have some kooky beliefs? You told us earlier." "Those people are not who you should be worried about," Marsh said flatly. She was staring out the window again. The sun was now beginning to sink below the horizon. "Worried? We're not worried. Who should we be worried about, Miss Marsh? These, your Grace people?" Carrington asked. He pulled up a chair and sat in front of Marsh. "Tell us about Jack Turner," Guthridge said. "Is that who we should be afraid of?" "No," Marsh said, still staring out the window. "Does Turner belong to this group? What's his association with them?" Guthridge asked. "Jack Turner?" murmured Marsh. Then she gave a little heave, stifling a laugh. Marsh said, "It was like they were just in his way. Acolytes are just like you and me. The thralls, too, kind of. He batted them all out of the way. It was his grace he was after." "The prince?" Carrington asked. "Are we back to talking about these fellows who ride around in Cadillac trunks full of dirt that you keep referring to as your grace?" "Yeah," said Marsh. "Some of them do, I guess." "A prince is one of those guys Jack Turner shot yesterday?" Carrington asked. "Yeah," said Marsh. "You think Turner is going to show up here again?" Carrington asked. "Maybe have second thoughts about letting you live?" "No," said Marsh. "You're not worried about Turner harming you at all?" asked Guthridge. "Nope," said Marsh, shaking her head just slightly, staring at the sunset. "Then who is it that gets you so upset just by thinking about?" Carrington asked. "Miss Marsh, who are you thinking about right now?" "Wouldn't use who," Marsh said. Carrington pulled out his notepad and opened it to where he had penned the name LeBlanc. Without a word, he showed it to Marsh, who nodded in confirmation. Then Carrington showed the notepad to Guthridge. "Okay, so we're back to these fellows in the dirt trunks?" Guthridge asked. Marsh said nothing, but slowly started to nod her head up and down. "Why don't you go ahead and tell us why we should be worried about these fellows?" Carrington said. "You don't want to know," Marsh said slowly, almost in a whisper. "Try us," said Guthridge. The sun was hanging low in the sky. The deep, wide, murky creek was completely shrouded in the shadows cast by the trees on the embankment. The water stank of agricultural runoff and 100 other vile byproducts of the modern world. Nobody had taken a dip in this section of river, or floated down it in a tube, or eaten a fish from it in a generation. It was one of the countless waterways in the United States that American life now ignored, generally turning its back on them while any attention paid, if at all, to outdoor life got swallowed up by shopping centers and superhighways. The creek was now little more than a no-man's land, an open sewer, an obstacle for people in cars to get over or around in their rush to be somewhere else. An old abandoned chapel stood just past a copse of young trees. The trees grew just a few feet from the banks of the creek. The chapel windows were all boarded up, and its roof was starting to fall in as time flowed by. A relatively new tennis shoe floated down the creek next to the trees that occluded the chapel from view. Clouds of frolicking dragonflies flitted on and off the shoe's upturned sole. Next came a mostly empty water bottle, a third of the way full but upright and still afloat. Then came a milk jug. A bulging trash bag, neatly tied with its plastic ribbon, came floating down a few feet from the milk jug. But the trash bag's course began to deviate from the other flotsam as it came near the copse of trees that screened one side of the old ecclesiastical ruin. The trash bag moved perpendicular to the lazy current and traveled to within a few feet of the bank. Jack Turner emerged out of the water. Holding the bag in one hand, he stepped up onto the mud of the bank and then stepped into the underbrush and the cover of the small trees. There he squatted for a while, letting the air dry him off. He looked up and watched the sun. When Turner figured he was now in the last hour of daylight, he stood and dumped his clothes and shoes out of the trash bag. He got dressed and ducked down under the boughs of the trees that sheltered the back of the old forgotten chapel. The parish that owned the land had not yet gotten around to demolishing the decrepit old building. However, someone had put a padlock on the chapel's front door. There was also a padlock on the tiny doorway in the rear of the building, but the structure had been left unattended for so long that dry rot had deeply set in. Turner did not need a key for the rear door. He simply grabbed the rotting frame around the door with both hands and lifted the entire thing out of the wall, door and all. Turner set it leaning against the back of the chapel, then stepped inside. Inside the chapel, the day's last rays of sunlight filtered through the void left open in the back wall where Turner had removed the door. All the pews the place used to have were long gone. The altar was bare and unused. The floorboards were cracked and warped. There were water stains running down all four walls from where their tops met the rotting and porous roof. The place stank of dust, dead things, and mold. On the floorboards at the other end of the building, beneath the opening to the belfry overhead, lay a group of dead bats. In life, they had short hair that was silver-gray on their bellies and dark on their backs. Their tiny mouths now were cracked wide open in death, exposing vicious, needle-like teeth. The tiny eyes were all gone from their sockets. The only movement was the few worms that churned among the ribs of their small, flattened bodies. Turner let his back fall against one of the walls. Then he let his thighs relax, and he slid down to the floor. He sat staring at the dead bats. As he did so, a smile started to creep over his face. Turner had been worried that the silver bullet would not be able to punch all the way through the wall of the car's trunk and then also pierce the back seat of the car. But in the end, it worked perfectly. With one hand, Turner extended a forefinger at the dead bats on the floor and held his thumb straight up. Then he let his thumb fall and jerked his hand slightly, mimicking recoil. "Gotcha," he said. Then he raised the finger to his lips and blew across its tip. Turner let out a deep breath. He sat and rested as the light grew dimmer. For the first time in a long time, he began to allow himself to imagine a future, a vague somewhere else. He could maybe start building a normal life, maybe work a normal job, where a check gets somehow dumped into a bank account after taxes are taken from it. Maybe he would buy more than just one set of clothes. Turner imagined paying rent on a place that had a roof and running water. He thought about owning one of those cell phones. Turner looked up into the belfry, and his smile faded. He stood up and got directly under and looked up, squinting to make out the shapes high in the belfry rafters. "Where do you guys come from?" he gritted. Turner counted several new shapes hanging upside down from the rafters. They had not been there before tonight. A few looked just like the dead bats that lay at his feet, but they had all brown fur, not gray and black. There were several others about the same size, but had a different shape to their heads and ears, and these had pale cinnamon-colored fur. Turner could just barely make out a white blaze around the wings of these particular bats. On the rafters higher up were even more bats. These were a kind Turner had never seen before. These ones were at least 50% bigger than the others that dangled below them. Their heads were larger, like the heads of small puppies. They looked dreadfully primordial, not of this age at all. The last of the day's light finally faded. Turner backed away in the gloom and stood with his back against the wall, not moving. He kept his eyes on the place in the dark where the opening of the belfry was. There came a low rustling sound of leathery wings spreading out to their full width. This was followed by a growing cacophony of screeches. Turner could make out the movement of bats falling through the air and flying out of the belfry. At first it was the smaller ones. They made several circuits in the air close to Turner's head, then they separated. One cluster of bats found the gaps high up in the northern wall where it met the roof line. They squirmed through and took off into the night. The second cluster of bats did the same through the gaps at the top of the western wall. Then the silhouettes of the larger bats descended noiselessly out of the belfry in a cloud of pointed wings and long peaked ears. At first they headed straight towards Turner. He instinctively crouched, prepared to leap away. But the bats course-corrected and flew out the opening of the back wall where the door had been. Turner slumped back down to the floor and sat there, with his massive arms outstretched over the tops of his knees. His head hung down. This was not over. This was not over, and he had to keep moving. There was more than one prince operating in the area. They were aware of his presence. He had to go back to the city he had just escaped. Turner stood up and stepped into the grass outside behind the chapel. He felt the night air and took a quick breath. Nothing was standing in the trees waiting for him. There was no malevolent presence moving in on him through the dark. The bats had flown away, seeking their masters, but their masters were not there in the grove with him. His location remained undetected, and he had the night to himself. He lifted the door frame, with its door still firmly bolted to it, and carefully set it all back in its place in the wall. Turner started walking. He needed some money for a new shirt, and he still had to get the broken handcuffs off of his wrists. "Are you going to head back to your house and get some sleep now?" Guthridge asked. She and Carrington were sitting in her car in the hospital's parking lot. It had gotten dark. The sun was almost fully set. "No," Carrington replied. "No way I could sleep now. Not after all that stuff we just heard. You?" "Nah, I'm wide awake," Guthridge said. Then she shivered despite the warmth of the night air. "Holy crap, I don't know what to think of all that," she said. That was a whopper of a story." Carrington laughed cynically. "Oh, for Pete's sake, come on," Carrington said. "That was a load of hooey. That Marsh girl should have been a dime store novelist." Both detectives laughed a little nervously. "But still, I sure can't sleep," Guthridge said, shaking her head and looking out the car window at the evening shadows of the parking lot. The street lamps were starting to flick on, one by one. Guthridge suggested they go for food. Carrington said sure if she wanted. The two detectives briefly discussed where to go and settled on a new gas station-restaurant combination that had just opened up for business out by the highway exits. "How's your mom?" Carrington asked as they got seated in a booth at the back of the gas station's eating area. My mom? She's fine, Guthridge said. She asked how you were the other day, actually. She did? Asked Carrington. What did you tell her? I told her you were the same as ever, Guthridge said, just older. The two detectives ordered their food from the tiny electronic kiosk that was bolted to the end of their table. You know what this reminds me of? Carrington said as they were done ordering. What, this place? Guthridge asked. No, sorry, I meant Marsh's story she's been telling us, said Carrington. You remember the satanic panic? I mean, sure, Guthridge said. I read about it, and it's something they told us about while we were at the academy. It was some sort of mass hysteria. You should have heard the absolute nonsense stories people spun back then, Carrington said. There were whole books written by people claiming to remember being victims of satanic ritual abuse. It was all over the TV. It went on for years. Everybody believed it. Everybody. Even cops. It was kind of like we just heard back at the hospital. Yeah, I guess I remember that when I was a kid, Guthridge said. Nobody really talks about it anymore. But yeah, I think one time a couple of cops showed up at our school, and we all got to skip class to sit in the cafeteria listening to these cops tell us how Satanists were waiting to jump us when we walked home from school that day. Total made-up nonsense, Carrington said. All of it. And that's exactly what the stuff coming out of Marsh's mouth reminds me of. Don't forget those people Marsh called acolytes, Guthridge said. Well, hold on about that, Carrington said. Well, you think they're real? Guthridge asked. Actual people are usually real, Carrington said. There were real people in the woods the other night. I've no doubt about a real person who just got shot with one of Jack Turner's silver bullets. But I doubt any of the rest of it. We just got to figure out who these people actually are. Why is she making all this stuff up? Is she covering for Jack Turner? Protecting a murderer? Guthridge asked. I'm definitely prepared to consider Marsh was some part of some kind of criminal activity, whether it involved a cult or not, and is now trying to cover for her own actions or her close associates, said Carrington. We still need to figure out if there was a murder in those woods earlier this week and where the body is. Well, then, what do we know for sure from all of Marsh's storytelling? Said Guthridge. We know that Turner definitely had a gun, said Carrington. Gunpowder residue doesn't make up stories. We know there are multiple cars, no doubt about that, said Guthridge. Our next move is to find these people who own those cars. Get some of them in an interview room. Carrington said, How do we find them? Look for Cadillacs? Let's not waste our time with that. Guthridge turned for a second, looked out the interior of the eatery at the other customers coming and going. She brought her elbow up on the table and rested her hand on her lower face. Carrington knew this look. Guthridge was mulling things over. She had a track record of making connections others never did, and doing it in a way that yielded a high percentage of accuracy. Carrington kept quiet. We're going to hang on to Marsh as long as possible, Guthridge finally said. Keep her in the hospital as long as we can. Make her know this is what it takes for us to protect her. Get her comfortable with us, Carrington agreed. If we can do that, keep her talking, she'll slip up eventually, said Guthridge. She's got to slip up soon with a huge story like that. Also, I hate to say it, she's our bait. We need to keep her in custody. Either Turner will show up, or Dennis Peltry, or one of these acolytes or thralls or whatever they call themselves. One of them's going to poke their little heads through the hospital doors. I want to snatch them up when that happens. She went quiet and considered things a bit more. If Jack Turner doesn't know Marsh like she says, how in the world did he find her and all of them in the woods? Carrington finally heard Guthridge say. That doesn't make any sense. Well, Marsh claims she's never seen Jack Turner before he climbed out of the trunk of that car, Carrington said. I don't believe her, of course. We gotta get those answers out of her. We'll arrest her if we have to. Eventually, she'll give us something to charge her with. If Turner doesn't show up first. Anyway, that's what I think. Yeah, me too, definitely, Guthridge said. Guthridge took another sip of coffee and then shook her head. Guthridge said, And why? What's Turner's beef with his cult? We need to establish motive. And right now, we have nothing. We gotta find Dennis Peltry, Carrington said. It's the only other name we have right now. Maybe not, Guthridge said. We gotta recover Turner. Everything hinges on that. Good luck getting him to talk when we find that boy, Carrington said. Their food arrived. Guthridge immediately tucked into her meal. After a few bites, she noticed Carrington was not eating what was on his plate. Oh, no, Detective, don't start doing that, she said. I want to see you eat. Don't just stare out the window like that. Carrington smiled at the younger detective. He made himself eat a little of his food. The sun had set. 2 separate clouds of bats wended their way through the night, gliding and swooping on currents of miasmal air. They flitted through treetops. Their tiny black silhouettes flickered in and out of the glow of street lamps. They screeched maniacally as they flew past the blank, empty windows of abandoned buildings and trees dripping with Spanish moss. On the roads below them, 2 Cadillacs, one black, the other red, rumbled towards a sprawling stone mansion that sat on an anomalous high point in the middle of a forest that was otherwise a wetland. One cluster of bats converged in the air over the black Cadillac. The other cluster of bats converged over the red Cadillac. The bats flew in spinning rings over each vehicle, like halos for 2 princes of hell. A number of larger bats, more primordial in their appearance, were already arrayed along the highest roofline of the imposing and desolate mansion. They perched sitting upright, motionless as gargoyles. They were darker than the deepest trench at the bottom of the ocean, except for their tiny eyes, which glowed fiendishly as the 2 Cadillacs came up the gravel drive. The gloom inside the mansion never truly went away. The forlorn edifice was obscured from the world by the surrounding woodlands. It was a craggy shell made of blocks hewn from stone that was peppered with the countless fossilized bones of tiny primordial nightmares. The stone walls were like a scaly dragon hide that kept everything out, including light and time. Inside, the wood that formed the floors, the walls, and the ceilings was carved from a stand of old-growth forest from Papua that was so cursed no shaman ever dared set foot in it. The toxic oils the wood held in its grain absorbed any light and warmth found in the place, and exuded into the air of each ghosted room, crooked stairwell, and twisting passage a putrid dampness. Hirth and Damien stood in the mansion's antechamber. The room was barely lit by a single candle. Hirth's head was still swollen from where Jack Turner had punched him. Damien's testicles were still giving him grief from where Turner had kicked him. Damien's burns were already beginning to heal and scab over, but they still smarted. Same with the stab wound. Both men faced the door leading into the main hall. Both were pensive and motionless. Damien stared morosely at the desiccated, blood-red tapestries that hung from the antechamber walls. Hirth stared morosely at the ancient and threadbare carpet. "We have to continue," Damien hissed. "We are committed. There is no other way. Do not even begin to think there is another way. They'll smell it on you. Don't entertain any hope for a single second they won't." Hirth made no reply. The dark clack of a mirthless handbell could be heard through the door leading to the main hall. "Blow that out," ordered Damien. Hirth blew out the candle, and immediately both men were cast into pitch dark. Damien felt around and found the rustic knurled handle for the door that led into the main hall. The door's hinges gave a portentous groan as he swung it open. A wave of cold air and the smell of mildew wafted over both of them. Damien fumbled to his right to find the silk tether bolted to the wall next to the inner doorframe. He grabbed hold of it and followed it blindly into the blackness of the main room. Hirth did likewise and followed after Damien, with one trembling hand on the tether. Voices, bleak and forsaken, filled the air around the two men, echoing off the rafters high overhead. There were at first two distinct voices. They conversed in a stilted cadence, like two gravestones addressing each other. "These creatures inherit knowledge as centuries pass," one of the voices was saying. "You forget that, LeBlanc." The voice that was LeBlanc replied, "Their blood still tastes the same, Zentry." "The chattel are in time, LeBlanc," replied the voice that was Zentry. "I still remember time. Time mixed with knowledge alters the chattel. It is inexorable." "Zentry, we, not the chattel, are the princes of this world," replied LeBlanc. "But the chattel must never see with their eyes," said Zentry. "Always with fear, always with hatred, else they change." LeBlanc replied, "A few can be loaned knowledge." "Your few will breed," Zentry grumbled. "A few, then destroy them," LeBlanc countered. "What of Turner?" A third voice, grim, haunted, and execrated, intoned in the dark. Those words from that voice caused a spectral change in the air, and the room grew ice-cold. "That unspeakable name, I'll call that aberrant," snarled LeBlanc in a wretched tone. "Oh," the third voice rejoined gloomily. "Really? How?" "I will orchestrate its demise," LeBlanc's voice slowly hissed like a writhing serpent. "You will?" inquired the third voice. "How so? Where is he now? Can you augur Turner's presence, LeBlanc? Can you, O Zentry? You cannot. None of us can. I will raise up a new instrument," answered LeBlanc. "We are time's outcasts," replied the third voice in the dark, in an accent that contained a remnant of a time when men fought for dominion with drawn swords. "We are doomed to witness the death of the universe. We must keep to all shadows until that next era. You must mystagogize not a single other one from the chattel or of the acolytes." A keening, high-pitched wail rose up and cut through the darkness of the room. It caused Hirth and Damien to flinch, and they shrank back. "What of my beloved, slain by silver?" cried LeBlanc in a sudden plangent wail. "What of he who I raised up just to be butchered by that chattel, Jack Turner? The one I saved from time's death grip is now just these ashes, these fragments. Tell me, Lord Reconquista, tell me." Damien sensed Hirth starting to turn away. He reached out in the dark. His hand found the front of Hirth's collar and gave it a vicious tug. Their intellects must remain thoroughly darkened, the deep, archaic voice of Reconquista warned. No more from this era must you educe. You have pushed too far, and now time has pushed back. Jack Turner is a disaster, Zentry whined. But LeBlanc remained defiant and cried, By the indifference of the cosmos, so mote it be. Hirth and Damien felt the molecules in the air around them suddenly shift at a 90-degree angle. To their complete terror, they both realized the entities in the dark had turned their abominable focus upon the two of them. LeBlanc's voice savagely cracked. Our instruments grow weak. Their ardor fades, Zentry's voice, a sniveling Pule, chimed in. Malvadados, Reconquista hissed. There was a sudden movement in the air next to Hirth's ear. It felt like the flutter of a bat's wing. In the next instant, Hirth was showered with the bloody spray of what used to be Damien's head. I elevate to greater darkness the one they call Petey Gee, Hirth heard LeBlanc say to him. Fetch him forth, thrall. Immediately, your grace, cried Hirth, and he turned and ran from the accursed place. Goose strode out into the circle of men who waited for him on the dojo floor. They all went silent in his presence. Goose was ex-military, a decorated SEAL. He stood 6'4" in his crisp white gi with a stiff white black belt tied prominently around his lower abdomen. He was a man who commanded attention and inspired silence. We're going to get started in a sec, Goose boomed in his deep voice. His students, barefoot, all decked out in their own gis of different patinas of off-white and belts of differing colors, waited in deferential silence to hear the hand-to-hand combat master's pre-training wisdom. I've talked to you all often about self-defense, Goose said. I have stressed to each and every one of you that in the end, it's all about survival. It is not about dominance or winning an argument. You train to stay alive. That's it. Nothing else. He paused for a moment. Of course, there were no interjections from among his listeners. They all waited to hear what this tall and formidable warrior had to say next. We train to fight. We train our minds and bodies to be weapons. But only, and I mean only, if we need them, he said. Quite often, Goose continued, the way to stay alive is to not fight at all. Goose let that sink in for a moment. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. He continued. The key to winning a confrontation quite often is simply not to engage. Now, I'll tell you a story. This happened to me just last night. There was a sound of rustling canvas as all of his students perked up to listen even more closely. I was getting home, late from work. Goose began his tale. I stopped at a gas station near my house. It was dark that time of night, but the pumps where I was standing beside my Jeep were all well lit. I didn't see the guy. I didn't hear the guy. Suddenly, he was just there. Pensive glances, shifting feet. This guy was about my height, but a little taller, Goose went on. He was young. I think he was still a teenager. But already, this guy looked like a piece of military hardware. I served 10 years in the U.S. military. I've seen the biggest and I've seen the baddest. I fought a couple of them, too. Let me tell you, this guy outclassed them all. Goose's top black belt piped up. Was he a black guy, a white guy? White guy, Goose said. Blonde hair, blue eyes, tall, rocky, square, fingertips practically reaching his knees. "He came up to you at the gas station?" someone asked. "Yep," Goose replied. "He got past all my layers of situational awareness. The same situational awareness that kept me alive in Afghanistan and half a dozen other places. This guy blew right past it all. I might as well have been wearing a damp towel wrapped around my head." "Well, what, did this guy rob you or something?" one of the students asked. "No," Goose said. "He just stood there looking at me, right there next to the gas pumps. He was well within arm's reach by the time I noticed he was there. First, he just kind of stared at me, and I stared back. He looked me right in the eye. He said 5 words to me. He said, 'I just need $20. The group of students standing before Goose opened up with a barrage of questions. "Wait, this guy tried to rob you?" one asked. "What did you do, Goose?" asked another. "Ha, I bet you ripped his lungs out, Goose!" exclaimed one of the yellow belts. "Nope," said Goose, silencing them all with that one word. Goose continued. "I kept my eyes locked on his, fished out my wallet, and handed him the cash I had inside of it without even looking." There was stunned silence in the dojo. "Out there, it's the real world. Trust me, the real world is deadly serious," Goose said. "My objective last night was not to prove a point to this guy. It was not to show this guy who's boss. My one and only objective was to get home safe to my family." "Oh, damn, so you just gave him your money?" a greenbelt asked. Goose remembered how eerily quiet the kid was when he had closed the distance on Goose at the gas station the previous night. Goose recalled how the kid took the wad of bills Goose had handed him into his giant fist, but did not look at them. He remembered noticing the kid had the broken ends of a set of handcuffs still around each wrist. A small length of broken chain dangled from one of them. "I only needed $20, the kid had said, still holding Goose locked in a freezing blue stare that could have made a whole squad think carefully before reaching for their rifles. "Nah, no problem," Goose had said. "Take it, man, no problem." The kid stepped back, turned, and vanished into the shadows just past the glow of the overhead lights. Goose, cursing himself, dove into his car and dug out his Desert Eagle from the glove box. He popped up, gun ready. When he scanned the parking lot, sweeping back and forth with his gun, the kid was gone. "I just handed him the cash out of my wallet and did nothing else," Goose said to his circle of students.